So now we're going to talk about Rule 18. And as we do that, Rule 18 is commonly known as the mark room or buoy room rule. It's a fairly complex rule, but the scenarios I think will help us sort it out and simplify it. It's part of Section C, and there's a preamble at the beginning of C that speaks to the fact that these rules do not apply at a starting mark surrounded by navigable water. So as we talk about buoy room, important to remember, does not apply before and at the start, okay? So good example where the preamble actually becomes part of the rule and really has a huge bearing on when these rules apply and don't in this section. So this rule opens by discussing when 18 does and does not apply. So whenever you have a rule where it actually has to make all of that clear using a lot of language, it tells you there's some complexity going on here. So we'll dissect that a bit and simplify it. But at its most basic form, Rule 18 applies between boats when they're required to leave a mark on the same side and at least one of them is in the zone. Zone defined in the book as that 3 boat length circle. Okay? Now, the rule goes on to state a number of situations where it does not apply. So it doesn't apply between boats on opposite tacks on a beat to windward. It doesn't apply between boats on opposite tacks when the proper course at the mark is for one but not both to tack. Between boats approaching a mark and leaving it. And again, we'll go through these scenarios. And then if the mark is a continuing obstruction. We talk about the definition of a mark. Very important when we're talking about mark room. The mark is the mark. It is not the ground tackle or the anchor. So you can absolutely touch the anchor line of a mark and you're not hitting the mark. Now, if you touch the anchor line and suck the mark into the boat, which is what usually happens when you grab the anchor line, now you've hit the mark. But it's important to understand that distinction. The tackle of the mark is not the mark. The mark is the mark itself, okay?
Hey Rick, if a big piece of seaweed catches the mark and it's hanging 20 feet down, can I hit that or is that a penalty?
If a big piece of seaweed tangles up on the mark
and it's hanging to lure,
you can hit the seaweed. You just can't hit the mark. So, okay, and then more definitions on zone. So let's take a look at some scenarios and kind of make this come alive in terms of does this rule even apply or not in these scenarios. Okay, so here we have 2 boats. Opposite tacks beating to windward. Okay, so the question is, does blue have mark room on yellow? What do you think? Nope. Yep, and it does not apply between boats on opposite tacks on a beat to windward. So if you're blue, you can't come in there on port and say, hey, I have mark room, I have rights. Let's take a look at another scenario. Here we have 2 boats overlap, sailing into a weather mark. What do you think? Does mark room apply here? Yep, lots of heads nodding yes, that's good. Yellow, in fact, does have mark room and over blue in this scenario. Okay, here's another scenario, a little bit different, similar but different. They're on the same tack, sailing to windward. Looks like blue is pinching up a bit to make it, but yeah, it looks like they'll make it. What do you think? Well, when we take a look at the rule, yep, it does. So assuming yellow can close on them, which might happen in this case because they're probably going faster, blue would have room in this situation. Okay, now here we have a little different situation. Same tack, right? Yellow is making the mark. There's no amount of pinching that blue can do to make it. they're not going to get there. What do you think?
He can call room all he wants, but the reality of it is as soon as he tacks, he gives up his rights.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Okay, now we're coming downwind. And just a reminder, the wind is always going down the screen, right? So now we've got boats sailing downwind. Blue's on starboard. Yellow's on port. Does 18 apply here? Is there mark room? Assume this is a leeward gate. What do you think? But it actually does apply because blue is already in the zone. So their 18 would apply in this scenario. So let's assume a landmass that's an obstruction. In that case, it does not apply because of D. So if the mark's a continuing obstruction, an island, something that is immovable, Actually, Rule 19, which gets into room at obstructions, applies. 18 does not.
Like a fisherman moored could be.
It could. Yep. Yeah. Another vessel, that would be a vessel as defined in the rule book. They don't have to be competing. Could be an obstruction. Absolutely. How about in this case? So here we have blue entering the zone. Looks like they're inside of yellow. Rule 18 apply here? Is there a mark room? Yeah, blue's got room. How about here? Now we got some interesting angles going on. Yellow's just getting to the zone, and blue is still quite a ways away. Are these boats overlapped? Back to our discussion of overlap. Yes, because when we take a line and draw it, see the imaginary line coming off yellow's transom? You see how blue is in there? And this is where there's a lot of confusion, because many times yellow might be going slower than blue. And if blue comes in really heated up, they might come from a long distance away, but they have room. And a lot of times yellow doesn't see it that way. But in fact, blue does have room in this situation.
So it's at the moment, the rule is established at the moment
The first boat hits the zone.
when the first boat hits the zone.
Correct.
Regardless of which it is.
Right, right. And so this is a great example because they're on opposite jibes, right? So we've got a port and a starboard, but one hits the zone, but they are overlapped. And because of that overlap, blue has the rights to come in there. And so again, in fast boats, especially spinnaker boats, you know, we'll see blue close that distance. It happens. Yeah, I love the question. So I'm going to paraphrase the question, but fundamentally, it doesn't matter how far blue is away. So, you know, what we see in fast boats like E-Scows and A-Scows, that could be hundreds of yards. So when yellow hits the zone and does a takedown, if they shrimp the kite and they're sitting there, that boat, blue, could close on them hundreds of yards in a heartbeat because of the speed difference. They could be going 4 or 5 times faster, easily.
And yellow's obligation is just to give room to pass between.
Yeah, correct. They have to give the mark room. So when you're yellow, you have to really project back up the course and see who's overlapped with you. And you have to anticipate that because you have to understand that blue has room in this situation.
Does it matter what marker they're going to since it's the gate?
It doesn't. In that scenario, it doesn't.
Here's a question for you. So let's say yellow is cognizant of this issue and
Yes.
is worried that something's going to happen. So they sail up a little bit above the mark right before they get there.
Yeah.
Before they actually cross that circle, they crank it down, killing the overlap.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is a tactic, is the angle of the transom matters, right? But the real issue is, you know, if there's a dispute, you've got to be able to, you know, and this is true of both boats, you have to be able to, you know, demonstrate that that was in fact the case, right? So, you know, if you went into a protest hearing and you were yellow and asserted that you broke that overlap, you know, right at the last second, you should expect a lot of questions from the jury as to how exactly you did that. So most savvy juries are going to ask you a bunch of questions to say, is that really what happened or not? So it is a tactic, and it's a valid tactic, but you know, it's one that if it's not obvious, odds are blue's going to have a very different point of view on that. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. So 18.2 talks about giving mark room. So this is the basic when the boats are overlapped, the outside boat shall give the inside boat mark room. And then there's an exclusion. So you can see here we've got yellow and blue. We've talked about a couple of these scenarios already in terms of who has mark room. Essentially the outside boat needs to give that room. So let's take a look. We've talked about overlap, right? And we went through the definition of overlap and the illustration of that. In 18.2b, when a boat is required to give mark room, she shall continue to do so even if an overlap is broken or a new overlap begins. So what that says is, think of a snapshot right when the boat hits the zone. Whatever the answer is there is the answer that sticks through the whole rounding. Doesn't matter if somebody speeds up or slows down once that first boat's in the zone. Okay, and we'll see some scenarios that show that more clearly. And then 18.2 B and C cease to apply when the boat entitled to mark room has been given mark room. In other words, mark room doesn't last forever. Even if you have it, you only have it for a certain period of time, and that has to do with when you're leaving the mark. We'll talk about that further. Or if you pass head to wind or just leave the zone, it ceases to exist. So the point there is mark room is a point in time right. Doesn't last forever. As you're rounding the mark and departing, it goes away. If there's reasonable doubt that a boat obtained or broken overlap in time, it shall be presumed she did not. This is one of the few places in the rule book where it's really explicit on this. So you might imagine that, as a judge, when I'm listening to a protest, I pay attention to that language. If I'm not clear or our jury isn't clear, we're going to presume it didn't happen. And the rule explicitly states that. So it does put an onus on the sailors to really be able to demonstrate, their point of view if you get into a protest hearing on this. So let's take a look at some scenarios here. Here's a common leeward mark, blue and yellow. And this is how it is supposed to work. Right? Blue has room. When yellow hits the zone, they're overlapped. Yellow gives blue room, and at that point, off they go upwind. So this is, if it were only always so clean, right? But this is what right looks like.
It's always that way on NAG.
So always that way on NAG. That's good to hear. So here's a little different situation. It's going to get a little messier here. So they're not overlapped when blue hits the zone, but then yellow closes in. Remember the snapshot, right? So when they enter the zone, see the line off blue? They're not overlapped, but then yellow comes in there anyways. And blue says, no, you don't have room, and forces yellow to bail out.
West Sea Sailors, this is the point where Craig has already been yelling no room since the 6th mark.
Well, communication, even though the hail's not binding, good communication early on can go a long way towards preventing this surprise. So at this point, what we see is, no foul has occurred because basically blue doesn't give yellow the room that they were not entitled to, and yellow has to bail out. This presumes, if yellow ran over that buoy, the simulator looks a little bit like they ran over the buoy, they would obviously have to do their penalty for that. And yellow still has to round the mark. They haven't rounded the mark yet. Okay, here's our wider angle scenario coming in, and here yellow closes the door. So at position 1, are these boats overlapped? Look at the transoms. Yes or no? Yep, they absolutely are. So yellow closes the door, says, blue, you don't have any room in here. You came in from this weird angle. Well, yeah, they're overlapped. So, when we go back and look at the way the rule is worded and the definition of overlap in mark room, yellow gets penalized for not giving blue room in this scenario. Let's take a look. Here we have a couple opties coming in. Opposite angles. Here yellow closes the door again. Let's see, are they overlapped? Yeah, they are overlapped again, angles. So part of the point of this scenario is it doesn't matter the length of the boats, it doesn't matter the speed of the boats. They could be different classes. Different length boats sailing on the same course, different speeds. Doesn't matter, it still works the same way. In this case, yellow closes the door when blue has room, yellow gets penalized.